I'm Afshin Ratansia. We're going underground as the National Demo for Palestine marches across Britain protesting Theresa May and Donald Trump's military backing of slaughter in the Middle East in violation of UN resolutions. Coming up in the show. Is the US two-party system about to get caught in a gravalanche? The 2020 US presidential candidate fighting to push politics left, Mike Gravel, on the importance of being loyal to ideas, not parties. And Labour's former shadow communities and local government minister Chris Williamson gives his first international interview since his suspension from Jeremy Corbyn's party. Plus, amidst Brexit chaos and in a country damned by the UN for malnutrition...
The Right Honourable Gentleman's question must and will be heard.
The Speaker has to interrupt Parliament because someone got the royal title of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry wrong. All this and more coming up in today's Going Underground, but first, to a man called out this week by Donald Trump's Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. The former CIA boss has been in London condemning Jeremy Corbyn for opposing Washington's plan to overthrow the government of Venezuela.
It is disgusting to see leaders in not only the United Kingdom, but in the United States as well, who continue to support the murderous dictator, Maduro.
Pompeo in London there condemning the odds-on favourite to be the next leader of Britain as well as possibly the next leader of the USA, because Mike Gravel, opposed to UK-EU US-backed regime change in Venezuela, is running to be president in 2020.
Why do they hate us so in so many places around the world?
Because we kill so many people wantonly.
Oh, Joe, I'll include you, too. You have a certain arrogance. You want to tell the Iraqis how to run their country.
And we can get off of gasoline in 5 years, and we can get off of carbon in 10 years. All we got to do is want to do it.
Just plain get out. It's their country. They're asking us to leave, and we insist on staying there. The military-industrial complex not only controls our government, lock, stock, and barrel, but they control our culture.
And Mike Gravel joins me now via Skype from Birmingham in California. Thanks so much, Mike, for coming on the show. Before we even get to your campaign for 2020, what do you make of Mike Pompeo, the US Secretary of State, claiming in effect that you and Jeremy Corbyn are disgusting for not supporting a coup in Venezuela?
Well, of course, what he's suggesting that we should join in the murder that's going on in Venezuela. Keep in mind, with our sanctions, that there are going to be thousands of children that are going to be dying as a result of, quote, this coup. And how could he, with a straight face, talk about going and pulling a coup off in another country? I mean, this is against international law. This is against law in the United States. And it can only be perpetrated because Trump, who's a narcissistic fool, Pompeo, who is a religious nut, you know, he thinks that he's been anointed by God to go ahead and do these things.
Okay, well, Pompeo may say that, and some may agree with you, but it is the European Union, as well as Washington, that want the overthrow of Maduro. Even Tulsi Gabbard, your contender, fellow contender for the presidency or the primaries for the DNC, said Maduro is a terrible man. It's the European Union and Washington who want regime change there.
Well, but that's been the product of American imperialism, and that's something that the Brits should know something about. But our American imperialism is based upon the idea that we are superior to anybody else, and we can back it up with our ridiculous expenditures on military hardware. We have no business sanctioning people. What are sanctions? Sanctions are an attack on the lowest part of the society that we're sanctioning, the poor. They're the ones that suffer as a result of these sanctions. The leaders, and just look at Kim Jong-un, you know, he hasn't missed a meal in quite a while. And so are these sanctions effective? No, just the contrary. But the sanctions are immoral, because when thousands of children die, which, of course, we had the sanctions against Iraq under Clinton's presidency, and 500,000 children died. And our Foreign Secretary, Madeleine Albright, said, well, this is unfortunate, but it's collateral damage. Well,
yeah, Madeleine Albright said it's a price worth paying, but then, of course, this policy continues now with Iran. Surprised about the differing policies from the DNC candidates on Iran? You think Joe Biden will support the USS Abraham Lincoln being sent to the Persian Gulf to threaten Iran?
Of course he will. Joe voted for the war in Iraq. Joe's conventional wisdom with the American imperialism. The Republican Party at this point in time are really off the rails. They're the Trumpian party. But the Democratic Party, doesn't have that all clean a slate. The Democratic Party, under Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and Wasserman Schultz, sabotaged the legitimate election of Bernie.
We know that from WikiLeaks, of course, from the Podesta emails. Obviously, the founder of WikiLeaks is under arbitrary detention, as determined by the UN. I'm going to want to get into that a bit more in a second, but perhaps one reason the so-called mainstream media doesn't want to cover you, like, say, the Gilets jaunes protests in Paris, is that you're not a centrist like Macron or perhaps the parties in Westminster here or your friend Joe Biden.
But
how do you define centrism?
Well, centrism today is right. It's about halfway to far right. That's occurred in our country since Clinton, who really moved us to the right. And of course, this is what we hear from Biden, is that, he's a centrist. He's not a centrist. If you vote for the wars and you're essentially a warmonger and you buy into all the crazy expenditures of the military-industrial complex, that's not a centrist. A centrist would be a person that would act in a balanced fashion between what's going on domestically and what's going on internationally, and going around the world and instigating coups like we're done in Venezuela. The coup that we did with Gaddafi was just horrible, because after these coups take place, you have nothing but confusion, anarchy, and loss of life.
Even Bernie Sanders seems to be toning down his rhetoric about Venezuela. He is speaking up about Iran, though. Is that the reason you're running, to pull the agenda in that more progressive line? Because some people might say, well, why don't you just support Bernie Sanders and forget it?
The reason why I'm in the race is to pull the entire group to the left, and they'll wind up in centrist. But the effort to pull things to the left, in my mind, is just logic. What's so illogical about wanting peace? I'm an advocate for two things, basically. One is peace on Earth, and you can't accomplish that with continuing wars. And two, that even if good people get elected to office, what we need is to bring the people into the operation of government as lawmakers.
Obviously, Clinton was a war candidate, Obama was a war candidate, but Trump arguably was the peace candidate. He was the one saying he didn't want wars. And look what happened.
First off, I don't think he's smart enough to realize what Bolton and Pompeo are doing to him. And so they've manipulated him. When you get the National Security Advisor that claims that he ordered an aircraft carrier flotilla to go into the Persian Gulf, well, we've never seen that. In the days of Henry Kissinger, who really brought sway, he never ordered this. If it was ordered, it was done behind closed doors. But no, Bolton is such an egomaniac and really a horrible human being. If he were to have his way, we'd be at war a long time ago. But behind this, of course, is Netanyahu and Israel. We're trying to gin up a war with Iran. We're trying to gin up a war with Venezuela. Who's safe from us at this point in the world? And I could go into the whole nuclear problem that we face, which is insanity. And any country that buys into that doesn't realize, here, if we are spending somewhere around $3 trillion to refurbish our nuclear arsenal. The government says 1.7 trillion, but they don't count the normal cost overruns. But what does that mean? That means that we're spending this money to develop additional weapons or better weapons when in point of fact, it's the mother of boondoggles because you can't use those weapons.
We've seen how Ilhan Omar, the representative there, has been accused of anti-Semitism for raising Israeli power in the United States. Bernie Sanders, obviously, whose family, some of whom perished in the Holocaust, is being accused of anti-Semitism. Do you think you won't be accused of anti-Semitism for calling out Netanyahu?
I don't know, and I don't care. Netanyahu is an evil person. And if you love Israel, you have to oppose anything by Netanyahu.
You presumably have seen some of these WikiLeaks then, certainly about the pedestrian emails. What was your reaction to hearing that British authorities have detained Julian Assange in London?
Well, first off, I was very disappointed by the actions of the UK. I like many people in the world, admire the good side of the UK, not the imperialistic side. But what they're doing is bowing to American pressure, which is so typical since the Second World War of hanging on to us because the UK has lost its imperial, and thank God it's lost its imperial power because that was not the best part of the UK. Well, Julian Assange, in my mind, is a hero. And along with Chelsea Manning and the person who was the whistleblower over the NSA. We go around the world using our technical capabilities to spy on others, to sabotage others. We did that in Iran when we went in there and tried to change the codes on the centrifuges in Iran. They wised up. China's wised up. Now they have the ability to take a technology that we developed and use it on us, and we resent that. Of course, we resent that. They resent what we did to them.
Do you think Julian Assange would get a fair trial if the British authorities here agree to him being extradited to the USA?
No, he wouldn't get a fair trial. That's a given. Anybody who reveals the inner workings of government to the people, and of course that's a given that has to take place. If the people don't know what their government's doing, then of course they don't impact on the policies of government. So how can the people right now in the United States express themselves on moving the carrier flotilla into the Persian Gulf? What is anybody going to do? Mainstream media will sustain it, just report it as fact. But what can the people do?
Of course, Mike, you are at liberty, and you, together with Daniel Ellsberg, helped to promote the Pentagon Papers, which revealed the lies told to the American public about the war in Vietnam. But you are at liberty. So what do you mean the secrets can't be told?
Well, of course I'm at liberty. But here, I don't get... When's the last time you saw me on any main ABC, NBC? You know, that's mainstream media. The mainstream media is controlled lock, stock, and barrel by Wall Street and the military-industrial complex. And that's the tragedy in our society because there's no tools to alter that.
Mike Gravel, thank you. After the break.
It is disgusting to see leaders in not only the United Kingdom, but in the United States as well, who continue to support the murderous dictator, Maduro.
In his first international interview since his suspension, Britain's former Shadow Fire and Emergency Services Minister Chris Williamson exclusively responds to US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's damnation of Jeremy Corbyn. And Jeremy Corbyn arguably fails to best Theresa May on the NHS at PMQs as he avoids criticising a former US healthcare boss now running British universal healthcare. All this and more coming up in part 2 of Going Underground. Welcome back. You'd think Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn would be on safe ground criticising Theresa May over the NHS. Wednesday is the deadline for a new doctor's contract, and critics of the UK NHS master plan by former US healthcare multinational boss Simon Stevens accuse it of formally ending Britain's universal healthcare service.
Under a Tory government, spending on the NHS and investment in it is less than it was under Labour, and even with her funding announcements, remains the same case. Mr. Speaker, the complacent attitude and platitudes hide the reality that under the Tories, our health service is going through the longest funding squeeze in history.
But hang on, if he had been watching this show, he would have seen that the crisis in Britain's healthcare system is not necessarily a question of funding, though its government funding is half as a percentage of GDP that Donald Trump funds the US system. Here is what GP Dr. Bob Gill told us about why next week's deadline is so critical after years of Blairite Labour, Tory and Liberal governance.
They've spent years disintegrating the NHS, breaking it up between purchaser and provider. But what the integration that Simon Stevens is proposing is the integration of budgets before they're handed over to the insurance companies.
Yes, Dr. Gill is alleging a bribed GP contract that will lead to privatisation. So as long as Jeremy Corbyn doesn't talk about a structured contract that may end the NHS, Minority Government leader Theresa May can arguably brush away his jibes.
At the last general election, somebody said the following. They said that an extra £7 billion for the NHS would give our NHS the resources it needs to deliver the best possible care for patients. I wonder who that was. It was none other than the Leader of the Opposition. Is this government giving the NHS £7 billion? No. Is it giving it twice that? £14 billion? No. It is giving the NHS £20 billion. I'm proud of this government's and the Conservative Party's record on the NHS.
But will all that funding disappear into the pockets of the CEOs of big US multinational healthcare companies? Thankfully, there was a happier union of UK and US celebrated at PMQs in between MPs, pleading for starving constituents suffering austerity.
Members across the House, I'm sure, will also want to join me in sending my very best wishes to their Royal Highnesses, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex.
I join her also in welcoming the birth of the baby to the Duke and Duchess of Sussex.
Can I also congratulate the Duke and Duchess of Wessex and wish everyone that's had a birth over recent days. Sussex.
The PM suggested the leader of the Scottish Nationalists congratulate the Earl of Dunbarton because Prince Harry is also that too. But interestingly, much less mainstream media attention than given to Meghan Markle's baby was given to a celebration of another signal of US-UK collaboration by Prince Harry's brother, William.
Now, in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ.
Yes, that's the second in line to the British throne in Westminster Abbey, heckled with calls of shame on you before he used the Bible to celebrate Britain's weapons of mass destruction programme in Scotland. It's a multi-billion-dollar nuclear weapons mass killing system long criticised for being dependent on Washington consent. Well, joining me now from Derby in the East Midlands in his first interview since his suspension from the British Labour Party is its former Shadow Fire and Emergency Services Minister, Chris Williamson. Chris, thanks so much for coming on the show. Before we get to the threats of war, all week in Britain we've been hearing about our universal healthcare system, the NHS, and that GP doctors are under unprecedented pressure. Do you think it could be a part of a campaign to persuade them to sign on to Simon Stevens' new contract that critics say would be the end of the NHS?
Well, certainly the NHS has been under intense pressure from this government since they came to power in 2010, and the passing of the Social Care and Health Act in 2012, I think it was, has seen this drive towards privatisation. And this is just the latest iteration. This proposition that's being put to GPs looks on the face of it quite seductive, but the truth is it's dumbing down the service. It's going to result, I think, in people not getting the care by the professionals that they deserve and indeed pay for through the national insurance and taxation system in the country. And of course, what we're seeing is morale at an all-time low in the profession. More and more GPs leaving. And, many towns and cities now up and down the country are struggling, actually, to find sufficient GPs. So it's little wonder, that people are waiting, a week or 2 weeks sometimes to get a GP's appointment. And I think this is yet another attempt to try and start to impose charging on the system. And so it's something that, we do need to challenge very, very, very strongly.
Would you call on doctors not to sign it? Because Jeremy Corbyn's Health Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth, seems not to have said that.
Well, I certainly have said that and indeed have put something out on social media to that effect. I think it's really important that, the GPs do refuse to sign. Obviously, if there is non-compliance by the GPs, then clearly this is a system that cannot be imposed. But of course, what they're trying to do is to he's used sort of, if you like, bribery of the government to try and persuade GPs to sign up. But this is a very, very slippery slope, and people like Dr. Bob Gill have been setting out a very cogent argument as to why GPs should not sign. And so what I've been urging, and I would urge anybody who's watching this programme, to contact the GP and say, look, we're not happy about this, and please don't sign up to it.
You perhaps suspect, I don't know, how the British media are going to be covering the fact that your shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott will be addressing mass Palestine demos today in London. What do you think about the fact that perhaps there will be accusations, like there have been repeatedly, against your leader, Jeremy Corbyn, that he's an anti-Semite?
Well, I think standing up for the Palestinian people is the right thing to do. They have been grotesquely abused by the Israeli state, particularly by the Netanyahu apartheid regime. We've seen casualties running into the tens of thousands. We've seen people who have been injured, losing their limbs, having to have their arms, their legs amputated, people paralysed. We've seen doctors, medics, journalists, children targeted by the Israeli Defence Force. This is a humanitarian catastrophe that the Israeli state are visiting upon the Palestinian people. And I think all right-minded British people, indeed all right-minded people from around the world, will support the Palestinian people. And what we need, it seems to me, is for the Israeli state to abide by international law. They're flagrantly disregarding international law and are being given cover for that by the United States of America. It's an absolute outrage.
Well, I'll get on to Trump in a second, but Israelis say these Palestinians are terrorists. The BBC, Comcast, Sky News and others say Israel has merely been retaliating to rocket fire from, say, Gaza. And in fact, obviously previous Labour Shadow Home Secretaries certainly haven't addressed Palestine demos. A big change in Labour policy here, perhaps.
Well, indeed, there is a big change, and it's a good thing to see that happening. I think it's the right thing for the Labour Party to do. And yes, I mean, the media certainly haven't reported accurately, in my opinion, the scale of the onslaught from the Israeli state, and it's almost as if it's a kind of an equal struggle. But the truth is this military giant, the Israeli state, aided and abetted by the United States of America and Great Britain, has got to be said, using their power against a very weak Palestinian people. And, it's little wonder that sometimes some militants on the Palestinian side, retaliate. But I've spoken to many people who've been to Gaza, or been to the West Bank, and they've spoken to, hundreds of Palestinian people. I've spoken to Palestinians myself. I'm amazed, frankly, by their dignity. And what they say is all they want to do is to live in peace, to live side by side. But we have this huge ogre of the Israeli state inflicting this utter destruction on the Palestinian people, operating an apartheid state in Israel itself, where Palestinians are second-class citizens, don't have the same rights, are under military law as opposed to Israeli law, and this is apartheid writ large. It was Nelson Mandela himself that said that the struggle is incomplete until the freedom of the Palestinian people is realised. So I think it's a really good thing that Diane Abbott is addressing the rally today, and I hope that will go a long way towards raising consciousness still further amongst the British people, because we need to bring pressure on the British government to demand that the Israeli state abides by international law. We should be, as a bare minimum, in my opinion, be recognising the Palestinian state.
Any progress on what's been happening to you in the British Parliament? Any progress on your suspension for alleged anti-Semitism?
Well, I'm confident I'll be reinstated by the party. I mean, these grotesque accusations have no basis whatsoever, and I've submitted a very detailed and robust response to them. And obviously there's a process in the party now which we are going through, and they will be no doubt assessing my response, and it is hoping a decision will be made in the fairly near future.
Donald Trump says he is trying to change things. There's been an alleged leak of his deal of the century from Sheldon Adelson, saying US sanctions and military force may be used. But he's sending the USS Abraham Lincoln to threaten Iran. He says Iran is behind the Palestinians. What do you think about the prospects for a war?
Well, Donald Trump is a menace. We're seeing this latest development which is essentially, browbeating or attempting to browbeat the Palestinian Authority into submission with some proposition in relation to I suspect, the occupied territories, and with a threat that, if Hamas doesn't go along with it, of yet more military action against them. I mean, it's just so shocking. It's so appalling. That the leader of the most powerful nation on earth is acting in this bullying, hectoring way and supporting the utterly abhorrent activities of the Israeli state.
Well, Theresa May's Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt was standing next to Pompeo when Jeremy Hunt threatened Iran, saying it must not break the nuclear agreement in response to the US violation of it. And Jeremy Hunt indeed stood next to Pompeo, while he said your leader effectively was disgusting for supporting Maduro of Venezuela, and Pompeo indeed later said it's up to your leader to stop Cuba from supporting Venezuela.
Well, it's utterly absurd, and frankly, I don't think it's acceptable for the Foreign Secretary to stand beside Pompeo and allow him to talk in those terms. This man is trying to interfere in the British democratic process. He's no right to come to this country and refer to the leader of Her Majesty's opposition as disgusting in that way. That's totally unacceptable, completely undiplomatic language, if I could put it like that. Far from being disgusting, what Jeremy Corbyn is doing has been standing up for human rights. And it's a pity that the United States of America don't do that. I'm very proud, actually, of the stance that Jeremy Corbyn has taken on this, and indeed not just now, but throughout his political life. Actually, has stood up for what's right, stood up for decency and human rights around the world. And frankly, Mike Pence and Donald Trump would do well, frankly, to take a leaf out of Jeremy Corbyn's book and start to export peace around the world rather than the death and destruction that they're currently responsible for.
Well, Pompeo is the former head of the CIA, and he has already said when he was the head of the CIA that he wanted to target Julian Assange, who's now in detention in Belmarsh Prison in London. I understand you were there demonstrating support. Nothing from Jeremy Corbyn since his initial support for Assange, for him not to be extradited to the United States.
Well, Jeremy has made his position very clear on that, and I think that's significant, as has Diane Abbott, and made a very strong statement in the House about it. And obviously, there's regrettably, Julian Assange has now been, incarcerated now for some weeks, and I think has been sentenced to a period of time for skipping bail for understandable reasons. Obviously, that man should not be in prison, in my view. Most upstanding people in the country do not understand what is happening. How can somebody whose only crime really is to expose the most appalling war crimes visited on Iraq by the United States of America, and indeed has exposed other issues which, I think, the United States and other, governments around the world would prefer to keep secret, but I think the people have a right to know. That's all he's guilty of, and, we should be venerating Julian Assange rather than locking him away in Belmarsh, as he is at the moment.
Chris Williamson, thank you. And that's it for the show. Keep in touch via social media. We'll be back on Monday to ask the man who predicted the rise of Corbyn, a very British coup author, Chris Mullin, if the Labour leader's fall could come at the hands of MI6.